Thank you, Andrew, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. It's a bit nostalgic for me because I walked these hallowed halls in the vicinity of 40 years ago, and it's a lot more hard to find buildings now. Even the Great Court, I find it's a much more congested campus, but nevertheless quite special and beautiful, and of course with a very good reputation. The Australian Greens believe that all people are entitled to free, well-funded, high quality and lifelong public education and training. We understand that universities are places of both teaching and learning and of research, but both of these functions are vital to the nation's well-being and prosperity. We also acknowledge the broader role of universities in the intrinsic value of learning, the research that contributes to the well-being of our society, and the generation of public intellectual debate. In the last decade, public expenditure on higher education in Australia fell to be one of the lowest in the OECD, falling by 30% in the Howard years, and currently it is approximately 0.7% of the GDP that is spent on higher education. Given the neglect of higher education in this past decade and the diversity of issues that need to be addressed, the Greens are quite concerned that the mega portfolio of education, employment and workplace relations can lead to higher education not receiving the attention it deserves. This is why the Greens have called for the establishment of a higher education parliamentary secretary who can hear the concerns of the sector directly and action their feedback. Such an appointment would demonstrate the recognition of the importance of education to government decision-making. I'm going to just briefly address three areas: student support, higher education workforce, and research. Just as our society is increasing its expectation for participation by young people in higher education, it has failed to keep pace by adequately funding universities to provide the core services and support that students need. Larger classes, more crowded timetables, support services that are increasingly stretched, and an overdependence on lucrative overseas student fees have become features of the contemporary university. Universities and TAFEs strive to provide the best education they can, and in many cases they succeed, but the demands on our academic institutions have outstripped their resources, and the Greens will support measures to restore more realistic and adequate funding. Similarly, we believe that students cannot achieve their goals without considerable struggle when so many depend on long hours of part-time casual work to get by, and when so many give up the unequal struggle before the completion of their courses. We believe as a matter of principle that higher learning is a public, not just a private good, and will hold to our long-term goal of abolishing the HECS help schemes and forgiving debts incurred under these schemes. In the shorter term, we will build on our record of improving legislation, such as the government's changes to the youth allowance, and will support changes to the law that will remove the financial disadvantage faced by those who have had to leave home to study. The higher education workforce. The Greens recognise that the academic workforce is ageing and that demographic changes call for renewal as well as the retention of experienced staff. We support the NTEU's proposal to set aside 20% of each university's annual indexation as being conditional on the development of realistic workforce plans. And we strongly support measures to reduce reliance on casual academic appointments that are too often the fate of those who should be on the first rung of the career ladder. We know there is a genuine concern in universities across Australia about the culture of managerialism that now pervades our campuses. Exhaustive processes, for example, are now required for the most trivial changes to be made. One of my colleagues was telling me about a 3-page risk assessment needed for his postgraduate student to present a paper on the Gold Coast. There is widespread concern amongst academic staff that their primary roles, the conduct of research, teaching students and engaging with the community to solve problems, are being made more and more difficult because of these burdensome and often unnecessary requirements. The Greens will legally guarantee academic freedom and ensure all academic staff have the opportunity to pursue teaching, scholarship and research. Our academics must regain the freedom to direct their work lives in the most productive and creative directions. The decision to pursue an academic or scientific career is seldom about money, but a high level of autonomy in one's work is an aspect of this life choice, and we must not allow our university leaders to suppress this. Research. Almost all modern societies recognise the fundamental role played by research by solving practical as well as intellectual problems, and in shaping our economy as well as our culture. Research costs, but ignorance costs more. The combined National Health and Medical Research Council and Australian Research Council budgets last year were $1.39 billion.
This is Sandra Bayley from the Greens.
But it is one of the lowest per capita rates in the developed world. In absolute terms, it's not even half, for example, of the R&D spending provided to Finland's universities, not even counting the fact that Finland's population is less than 1/3 that of Australia's. Expressed in another way, Australia's total NHMRC and ARC budget is 3/4 of the research budget for the single North American Johns Hopkins University. Australian higher education has no shortage of talented people, but their capacity to make the key discoveries, to lead the way to a new country, new economy, is severely hampered by the low levels of funding. This prevents us even providing our budding young researchers with a decent wage and prospects beyond the next short-term contract. The Greens support significant increases in the longer term to our universities' research capacities, and will give these the priority they must have. This is not a luxury item in the nation's budget. It is the foundation of our prosperity and well-being. Finally, we must recognise that all of these policies for better supporting students and academics, for securing a stronger research base, for making our campuses into communities that will attract the talented and help them to achieve, are based on one vital premise. We cannot focus merely on the good while we ignore the absolutely vital. Without enactment of serious measures to minimise the extent and impact of climate change and move urgently to a renewable energy future, our universities, like the rest of our society, will be followers and not leaders. Our students will not have the future they aspire to, and our community will in so many ways be the poorer. We must listen to voices like those of UQ's celebrated conservation biologist Hugh Possingham, who has charted the way to preserve and restore natural habitats. Director of the UQ's Climate Change Institute, Ove Hoag Guldberg, whose recent paper in Science warns of the drastic and unprecedented change in global marine ecosystems.